The business of medicine is constantly changing. The review by Resolve discusses current contract issues for physicians, compensation trends, and tips for a successful career. Every physician's contract and career is different, and nothing in this episode should be considered legal advice. If you have specific questions about your career, please consult with an attorney. Now, on to the show.
Okay, we're back on the review with Lauren Kaufman. Lauren is one of our seasoned attorneys with Resolve, and we are going to talk about fair market value, negotiating compensation. Comp is obviously one of the biggest things that our clients come to us for. That's the thing that they think they can probably negotiate, right, as opposed to some of the other terms of the contract. So how many of your clients want to negotiate comp?
The majority, large majority. Okay. I think it's pretty rare when someone comes in and says, hey, I'm pretty happy with it. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's a conversation that we still have to discuss, but I think that's one of the main points of negotiation.
How many have already negotiated comp when they engage us to review the rest of the contract, you think?
Maybe 50%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that some of them are in the thought process of kind of let them bring it to me and then we'll discuss, sure. Right? But then a lot of times they'll have said, hey, no, I want this, and they've already gone up, and then that one gets a little bit harder if we're also wanting to go up.
Sure.
Yeah.
So when we're negotiating, so let's say there's the situation where they want us to help, mm-hmm. right? We're going to look at fair market value, right? And we're going to look at what the surveys say. We're going to look at prior contracts that we've done and kind of give them our best, right, estimate on what that should look like.
Right.
What do you get from pushback on employers when that data comes in?
I mean, I think it can be a variety of things, but a lot of times they'll say, we can't do this because our internal review has said that this number is our fair market value, and so we can't go above X, Y, Z.
Right. So you'll hear the word stark. You'll hear the word, there's all these rules and regulations around compensation.
Internal equity.
I actually have a little definition here that I want to make sure we're reading off. So fair market value, according to CMS, right, is an arm's length transaction that's consistent with a general market value. Doesn't mean a whole lot to me, right? Or doesn't specify a lot. They go on to say that they do not consider salary surveys to be the sole determinant of fair market value for physician services. Surveys are a great starting point, right? However, surveys and other data sources can be a starting point for figuring out what a physician's worth.
Sure.
So we're going to play a little guessing game on this, right? I've got a quiz for you. You didn't know this was coming. For internal medicine, we're going to start there. I'm going to have you guess and see what you think the median is, right, according to at least one survey, for compensation. Is it $208,000? Is it $250,237? Is it $305,886? Two more. Is it $286,343, or is it $312,736? Which one of those do you think is the median for internal medicine?
2+ years, or is this MGMA?
This is just everybody, right?
I'm
kind of
say
an all
the
practices.
237.
237. That wasn't an option.
Oh.
Did you mean 286?
What was number 2?
250.
Yes, 250.
Okay, 250,237. This is a trick question. All of these are a median. Right. So when we're looking at survey data, right, I think the thing that physicians don't understand is how many filters clients have, or not clients, but these surveys have.
Sure.
And so you can filter by geographic area. You can filter by practice type. You can filter by population size, right, demographics, how long you've been in practice. When you're talking with employers, what are they generally referencing? Or do they even get into what they're referencing?
It depends.
Yeah.
A lot of times they'll say they've done some type of internal survey, or they're working with an outside group who does their fair market value. I would say the large amount reference Sullivan Cotter as a survey data for them to kind of justify most of the time not going up to or meeting our request.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some of the surveys that are out there, Sullivan Cotter's one, MGMA is one. There's others, AAMC and AMGA, and then there's all the websites, right, that publish. So we have our own data. You'll see things from Doximity and Medscape and the recruiting firms, right? So there's a lot of numbers that are out there. I think what's important for clients to understand is that there's no one number, right? It's not like somebody can pull this number out of the hat and say, this is for your situation exactly what you should be paid. It's usually a range. Right. So how much do you think, in your experience, employers are moving from where they start to where they finish on comp?
I think it all comes down to leverage, right? So if certain clients come in with a lot of leverage, multiple offers, maybe a very hard to find subspecialty, depends on geographic area, where they're looking. So I think that someone coming in with a lot of leverage, we can see a lot of movement. Maybe.
What's the biggest move you've seen personally? And then I'll give you mine.
Well, I probably like 300,000 annually or more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the same number I have.
The one that I'm thinking of. Yeah.
So it was obviously a surgical specialty where the numbers are big
And
anyway,
in a rural
right?
area.
In a rural area. But what I think is always fun is we don't pick where they start, right? So
Right.
sometimes the employers will really lowball, right?
Yes.
For whatever reason. And then when you see the data, it's not even that you're asking for anything outrageous. It's just like, we have to be close to median, right? And you started
Exactly.
off at the 10th percentile. We can't do that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and you have to have that conversation with the client too, where because sometimes when you do ask for a $200,000 jump, which is rare to be,
seems
to be
outrageous,
very,
right?
very
It seems
clear.
outrageous. Yeah.
But again, like it's not our fault they tried to underpay you, and
Right.
so it makes sense. And the way I kind of discuss with my clients is when we use MGMA for our kind of compensation benchmarks, right? So that's a good place for us to start, but that is not always the place that we're going
Right.
to end up because there are so many personal and outside factors that were taken into
Right.
consideration in that recommendation.
Right. Do you hear from employers often that they can't go past a certain percentile
Yes.
in the surveys?
Yes.
Yeah,
and
okay.
and that number is never static.
No,
you
yeah,
know,
it's-
it'll be 60, it'll be 50, it'll be 75, you know, and then sometimes it'll be 75 or 25% of the 75%, you know, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of, funny math.
Yeah,
going
every
on.
institution has their own math that they like, and then they've
Yes.
decided that that's the rule,
Right.
even though the entire industry doesn't agree with it.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think kind of also going back to that, moving marker as far as what that fair market value is I have anecdotally, they've said we can't go above this because it's fair market value. And for a client who has a lot of leverage and says, okay, well, then I'm going to go another way,
Yeah.
all of a sudden that number's moved.
Right.
So I think that's why it's ephemeral in some ways because it's so there's so many factors to take into consideration there.
Yeah, I always chuckle at that because it's like
Yes.
we did our analysis and we've decided 65 is the right number on work
Right.
RVUs, and we're like, well, the median's 77,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're like, well, we can do 70. And you're like, oh, well, I thought you just said you had the analysis, right? So we don't
Well,
care
but it was
about
a
it.
range.
Yeah, right. It was a large range.
Yes,
So
yeah.
okay, good. So in order to maximize comp, if you're starting out, right, you're still in training. Let's say you're still in residency or fellowship. What would your advice be to somebody who wants to maximize their compensation?
I'd say get a lot of offers.
Okay.
Just because that gives you the opportunity to compare and contrast.
Mm-hmm.
And also for us, certainly we will do our best to work with the leverage that we have. But if we can say, so-and-so up the street is going to give them 450, you're only giving them 400, we need to match that in order for this,
Right.
for them to make financial sense to go here. So
Right.
that's a helpful marker as far as moving on comp.
Okay. And then if I'm in practice, how often do you think you should be re-looking at the data, checking it out, and deciding if you're still being paid fairly a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later? What's the cadence?
I usually say 2 years.
Yeah.
I think that most people renegotiate 2, sometimes 3. I think it depends.
Yeah.
Especially with like CMS and how the market can fluctuate there and the new surveys. But most commonly we talk 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. Yeah. So the surveys come out once a year, which I think is good for
Yes.
people to know. The only time I tell people to negotiate more frequently than like 3 years or 2 years is if your contract has some language in it that says we can modify your comp plan at any time.
Yes.
Because the employers, what we're seeing is that the systems are going to come back on a yearly basis and say, hey, we're going to adjust this. And so if
Definitely.
they're doing it, then you have to almost renegotiate at that time. Otherwise, I agree with you. 2-3 years is probably the right number.
Or, we do have a lot of residents or fellows who sign a couple of years in advance.
Oh, yeah.
And then, for example, I was talking to a client, they're signing 2 years, but we're looking at 2023 data. So I'm like, looks good now, but when you get there, maybe look after a year. Don't wait
Right.
until 2 or 3 years down the road because that, it may be to your benefit.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we've run the calculations in this. If you're off by 10% for your entire career, it's like millions of dollars, right? Because their comp is so high that it's going to cost them such a big number in total earnings and total net worth. So awesome. Anything else you want to add on compensation?
I don't think so.
Okay. Sounds great. Thanks.
Thank you.